It's an honor and pleasure for us to be a part of this event with Florida International University and with the participation and presence of Southcom and a number of other key government players. So for us, it's a real honor to be part of this. As we've talked about, as you've already heard from the presentation of the DASDs, we are living in an increasingly globally interconnected Latin America. And in that, you have an interaction between the very important and distinct dynamics that are going on within each of the countries in the region, and the way they're interacting with a range of extra-hemispheric actors, not only China, Russia, Iran, but others who have traditionally been in the region, the EU, India, increasingly Japan, South Korea, each with different agendas and styles and levels of engagement. And also, as you understand, what is happening to define the security environment today in the region is an interaction between not only commercial behaviors, including companies, the Chinese, the Japanese, others on the ground in the region, but also finance, political activities, and military, and the ways in which those impact each other. This is all to say that Latin America is an increasingly complex space that requires multidimensional strategic thinking. For our U.S. government team and for others, it really calls on us to bring in not only more resources, but the best of our multidimensional strategic thinking. It was of great benefit that our national security strategy that just came out and our national defense strategy did mention, as has been noticed by some in the region, Russia and China as a global challenge. It was also noticed that when former Secretary Rex Tillerson left for the region, he certainly offered his thoughts on the presence of China and Russia. I want to call out something that I believe is often very much misunderstood about former Secretary Tillerson's remarks. That although many interpreted it as a reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, I believe that for our Latin American partners, it is a mistake to think of it that way. And it's important to understand also that there is a discourse coming from Washington, the importance of Washington having a voice of explaining not why Latin America should keep away from Russia and China, but why the U.S. can and does offer a better deal. Certainly when we talk about China, there is evidence that China, as it's engaged in Latin America, is advancing in the region. Certainly the China CELAC Summit and its new three-year plan, 2019 to 2021, highlighted not only China's interest in expanded economic engagement, but also engaging in areas such as cyber, cooperation of transnational organized crime, and a range of other areas even more extensively than it was in the past. China, in its 19th Party Congress, talked about, in some ways, how China could be seen as offering a model for the developing world, although China has thus been relatively ambiguous about what the precepts of such a model for Latin America is. China has aggressively used its strategic partnerships as coordinating mechanisms with the 8 countries in the region with which it has those partnerships. China has made it clear with the Varela regime in Panama that its diplomatic truce with Taiwan is now off. And so the question now remains, especially for those countries in Central America and the Caribbean, and also Paraguay, who continue to recognize Taiwan, who is next, and what does that mean for the dynamics of the region? Chinese investment in the region is expanding, $113.6 billion approximately in the last 15 years, thanks to some very good investment figures that we finally have, thanks to the CCMX from UNAM, which my colleague Enrique Dussel will mention. China is clearly evolving also in terms of its financial vehicles, using commodities contracts, currency exchange reserve agreements. Countries such as Chile, who are offering as a clearinghouse for the use of RMB in transactions in the region. The involvement of companies such as ICBC and China Construction Bank and branch banking. And even though we see that lending by Chinese policy banks, such as CDB and others, are stagnant in the region, we see that there are important steps that are going forward in building the financial and commercial infrastructure by which China moves. But beyond that, there are also transformations that Chinese and other engagements are arresting in the region with respect to areas such as ports and in logistics sector, how not only the way in which Latin America is commercially wired to do business across the Pacific is changing, but in many ways how the players themselves, the European players, the Asian players, are all changing and regrouping in response to that. And we have one of the preeminent experts in the world on ports and logistics, Ricardo Sanchez, who will be talking about this today. We have major projects going forth in states who have had economic and other difficulties. Certainly some of the biggest Chinese advances are in Brazil. We have important advances in the sophistication and product offering of the Chinese military. Companies such as the Norinco companies, companies such as CEIEC, the AVIC companies in aviation and others. Not just in dealing with the ALBA countries, but Chinese military engagement in dealing with countries such as Peru, Brazil, where the Chinese were actually one of the players in both the new frigate program, as well as the naval program CESCAS, et cetera. To a certain point, even giving the Russians and Rosporan export a run for their money. Talking of Russia, it's of interest that in many ways Russia, in its engagement, not only is impacting the transition in Venezuela right now, has a looming relationship in Cuba with the new government of Miguel Diaz-Canel. Certainly, much has been said about possible Russian ties in Mexico, etc. Although one senses that Russia also is fighting against the loss of ground with the wave of elections which have moved Latin Americans' political spectrum a little bit more towards the right, with important restorations of center or center-right governments in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and in the prospect of more to come. We'll have to see what happens with Colombia. And again, other actors that it's important not to forget, the very important presence by India with IT and pharma and other sectors in the region, and other actors such as Japan, who continue to play a vital role through their trading companies in a variety of sectors. This by means of extended introduction to what I'm very proud to be able to bring this panel of 4 really world-class and world-renowned experts in different aspects of this engagement with extra-hemispheric actors in Latin America and their commercial, military, and political dynamics. You have or will have their bios as a reference, but I want to highlight a few things because I've had really the honor of working with each of these 4 gentlemen over the past 10 and 15 years. And so just very briefly, and I can't do credit to the quality of people we have here today, but going from my left and working down, Enrique Dussel, who since 2006 has been the head of something called CICIMEX, the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies at Mexico's largest public university, UNAM. Frankly, CICIMEX is certainly one of the largest and probably one of the best centers for China studies and China-Latin America studies in all of Latin America. And since its foundation, Enrique Dussel has been its director in stewarding that, as well as the China-Latin America network for studies. Enrique has truly been one of the pioneers with a well-earned reputation for quality empirical work and sound scholarship in political economy, helping to understand what's going on with China, especially in the region. He'll be focusing on the economic dimension of that Chinese engagement and engagement by other actors. Moving beyond, Ricardo Sanchez is currently the Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the highly respected United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, known as ECLAC or CEPAL for its acronym in Spanish. Ricardo is truly a global practitioner and scholar. Ricardo has actually worked in 28 out of the 33 countries in the region in his 30-plus year career, as well as working in Europe and Asia. And it's hard to find anybody who's more internationally renowned with respect to what is happening at a corporate level and an economic level with respect to shipping and port economic projects and transportation and infrastructure. Ricardo has some fascinating analysis and things to say about how the logistics sector in the region is being transformed and really the interaction between land, air, and maritime, and what that means not only for the commercial industry, but what that means for the strategic interactions of Latin America. Moving beyond, Andrei Serbin Pont is a regional security analyst and expert on Latin American defense industry, including the Russian and Chinese military sales and activities in the region. He's currently the research director at the Buenos Aires-based regional think tank CRIS, which in Spanish, Coordinadora Regional de Investigaciones Economicas y Sociales. He's also a consultant to really what is one of the most important bodies in the Argentine defense sector, the Secretariat de Strategic Affairs, although he will clearly be talking only in his personal capacity as an academic, which, mentioning that, Andres, don't be fooled by his apparent youth, is also a full professor at the well-respected Universidad del Salvador in Argentina. And last but certainly not least, Brian Fonseca, who is also here today, is the director of the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy here at FIU. And like Andrei, don't let Brian's youthful looks fool you as well. I've had the pleasure of working with Brian for more than 11 years. The things that have most impressed me with Brian is his ability over the years to integrate his ability as a credible scholar on Latin American security issues with his skills as an administrator and a practitioner, not only in running the Jack Gordon Institute, but really bridging the gap and bringing valued analysis by himself and his team to Southcom and the rest of the U.S. government policy community about what's going on in Latin America. He has a range of publications, but some of his most recent and important have to do with the role of Russia, Russia's media and other communication and social media. And so we'll be leveraging some of that most recent work that Brian has done to talk about what the Russians are doing in impacting the evolving shape of Latin America through those social media, as well as trying to tweak Brian and some of his very interesting insights that Frank Mora also touched on in how the Russians have relationships with the military and others in Venezuela that could be involved in shaping that transition. And so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give a few minutes of remarks, and then we'll come back and try to do another couple of rounds in a kind of a Davos light style of presentation, and then we'll try to take some questions from the audience. And so I'm going to go in the same order that I presented the speaker. So Enrique, if I could start with you, talking about China, Latin America, could you tell us a little bit, based on your work, what are some of the most recent developments in the Latin America-China relationship? And especially, could you tell us about some of the evolving presence in physical investments the Chinese companies are doing in the region, how that's evolving, and maybe how the position and sophistication of the Chinese companies who are doing work in Latin America are changing, and some of the issues that raises.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much to FIU for the invitation, and thank you very much, everyone. No? Look, regarding this question, a couple of topics that I would invite you to consider. No? Today in the morning, and to have some kind of discussion, we heard a lot of possibilities of bilateral ties and bilateral relationships of the U.S. in terms of military topics, economic topics, and respective Latin American countries. I would invite you to consider the concept of increasing new triangular relationships. This is historical bilateral relationships, such as the U.S. and Mexico, for example, that we have analyzed in detail, but also between Argentina and Brazil, or El Salvador and Guatemala, are today substantially changed by the increasing presence of China. No? I don't have anything against India, anything against Russia, but again, I would say the presence of China today in Latin America is very substantial, and you cannot compare it to India, to Russia, or to any other country. So, and as we heard today in the morning, even in the case of Venezuela, for example, in terms of the military, China is playing a role. No? So again, this concept of triangular relationships where historical, traditional bilateral relationships become triangular. China plays a role in each potential topic that you can imagine, from economics to military to culture to whatever. No? So I would invite you to take this new actor very seriously. You might like it or you might dislike it. But China is present in all of the region. We are working with ECLAC in Central America, in countries with diplomatic ties or without diplomatic ties, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in the Caribbean, taking the Caribbean very seriously, etc. No? Secondly, I would invite you to consider that at least in the last 5 years, also with this 19th Party Congress of the Communist Party in China, the recent 2 meetings in March of this year, and many other programs and strategies of the central government of China, China is proposing globally, but also in Latin America, a globalization process, as they say, with Chinese characteristics. No? The One Belt, One Road strategy, with dozens of very concrete instruments, as we will hear in a moment, is having a very substantial effect in Latin America, again, from the Malvinas to Mexicali. No? So take this seriously, because otherwise you think this is an abstraction. It's not an abstraction, as we will see. Finally, I would tell you, it is important to understand that the increasing presence of China is not only in terms of loans, as we heard today in the morning. I would invite you, this is the way we have been working in this academic network, from a socioeconomic perspective, to at least analyze in detail 4 topics regarding the Latin America and Caribbean and Chinese relationship. One is trade. Yes, so yes, since the 1990s, the trade presence of China in Latin America has increased dramatically. For more than 5 years, China is the 2nd largest trading partner of Latin America, the first of Brazil, Chile, Peru, and others. No? So trade is relevant. Second topic is financing. So there is a group, people at Boston University, Kevin Gallagher, who have been working on this topic of loans and credits. China becoming, in some cases and in some years, a very substantial creditor to Latin America, particularly in a group of countries and with a group of characteristics. Third topic, the topic of off-the or overseas foreign direct investment. On this topic, we've been working with a lot of detail. In the last 5 years, in average, China has been investing in Latin America more than $11 billion each year, all over Latin America, with bilateral with bilateral relationships and not. And the fourth topic is infrastructure, no? With the One Belt, One Road strategy and Xi Jinping's talks in 2013, China is massively presenting infrastructure topics in the region. We have accounted for more than 70 infrastructure projects and changing countries such as Ecuador dramatically, which is in less than 5 years, they have a completely new energy infrastructure that did not exist in history. I finalize with one topic, and to allow for a discussion, I would invite you, being here in the United States, to take this topic of this new triangular relationship very seriously. We have worked at this academic network on each of these 4 topics in detail, and this is substantially affecting the United States from a trade FDI infrastructure perspective. No? We were together with Evan in 2015 as a witness, a speaker in the US Senate, and we calculated that the massive displacement of US exports to Latin America, Mexico is the best case and best example of how China has massively displaced US exports in Mexico, is costing massive employment in the United States, around 1 million jobs each year, because again, the rise of Chinese exports vis-a-vis the decline of US exports to Latin America. I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. Ricardo, as you know, commercial logistics is not often discussed in strategic terms, and yet in many ways, those logistics flows both reflect and also drive Latin America's relationship across the Pacific and with the rest of the world. So could you tell us a little bit from your work how Latin America's logistic landscape is being transformed by this business, not only with China, but other Asia players? And if you could talk to us especially about these new alignments that are now occurring in the port and shipping companies and really the three principal areas of logistics: land, ports, and shipping, and what the role of Chinese companies are in that transformation. And I understand that you have a brief PowerPoint to start to present those ideas.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me use some evidence with my PowerPoint. Firstly, let me say thank you to the organizers, FAU and Evan, obviously. Let me talk about maritime transportation. Maritime transport remains strategic for international relations and the balance of power. Almost 90% of world trade comes and goes by vessel. In this context, containers are a strategic element. Port control is the second key element, and surface logistics is obviously the natural context. The game of the market in the logistics business, especially in the port and maritime sector, is called concentration. In this morning, I shall talking about the container business throughout the world, the concentration which accelerated in the post-crisis times was pushed by the combinations of larger ships and more powerful commercial alliances. If we consider that logistic business has three main parts: the surface logistics, mainly transportation and distribution, ports and shipping. My working hypothesis is that the shipping and port companies have a parallel trajectory with a clear control of the Asian and European firms, and the surface business is the next stage of the concentration and control. Throughout this presentation, I shall show both trajectories for the last 25 years. I am talking about port and shipping companies. And in this timeline, as you can see in the chart, a noticeable advance of Chinese companies in their incursion into the Americas, especially Latin America, can be observed. If you see the red color in the evolution of the concentration, and the pie of the current concentration is mainly controlled by Chinese companies and the rest of Asian companies, for instance, Singapore, Korea, and Japan. And the light blue is about European firms. In this chart, then, you can see how the shipping lines in the world in 1992, the first one, shared the transportation activity among a group of more than 30 firms. However, in recent years, 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and now, only we have three groups. One of these three groups is mostly European, the light blue, and the other two are Asian. The second is the majority of Japanese companies, with one from Taiwan and one from Germany. And the third one is mostly Chinese, with one company from Taiwan and another from France. This graph show the evolution of the alliances along with their market share. It is easy to see that in just 5 years, from 2012 to the last quarter of 2017, the concentration has accelerated. For instance, 83% of transportation supply from Asia to the west coast of North America is concentrated on these three groups. 65% from Asia to the east coast of South America is concentrated too. In this diagram shows the League of Global Terminal Operators, ordered from the top to the bottom by EQTTU, a small container, and their main connections among them and with other key agents in the logistics transport chain. GTOs show an important integration activity through mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, minority stakes, and alliances or agreements. Since 2000 to 2005, 2010, etc., but the intensity and size of operations have fluctuated over time, increasing notably in the last years. The main transactions done by the groups Maersk, CMA CGM, the French company, and the Chinese CMHI and CCS, CCS is the addition of COSCO plus China Shipping, have happened since 2015 until now. Since 2010, the intensity, number, and size of transactions were growing gradually. Between 2010 and 2015, big players like Maersk and CMA, CGM, but also emerging operators like CMHI, the Chinese company, and Yilport, the Turkey company, made an effort to expand their ties horizontally and vertically. Then, after 2015, the consolidation activity had a kind of boom where some of the main actors merged or acquired their competitors. Maersk with TCB and Hamburg Süd, COSCO with China Shipping, and stakes in CAGP, Noatum, OOCL, and others. In this scenario, emerging players that were latent became global. For instance, CSDP, China Shipping, CMHI, and Yilport, and others stopped being or were absorbed by their competitors. Other point that is not shown in the diagram is that referring to strategic agreements and more among competitors, where it's especially important the case of the Chinese companies who has signed agreements with Terminal Link, which is property of CMA CGM, the French company, over the One Belt, One Road with CCS as a strategic partner. CF Express and DP World, the Arabian company, who has signed agreements with CCS about OBOR. These figures show the evolution of the concentration in the port business using mergers and alliances, along with their market share. It is easy to see that in just 7 years, from 2010 to 2017, the concentration has accelerated. In red, it's possible to see the growing presence of Asian companies, especially from China and Singapore. On one hand, in 2010, Chinese global terminal operators held altogether 20% of the total market share. Currently, this percentage reached to 25%. Finally, in the especially talking about the Americas, the port sector is progressively filled with companies of Chinese origin. In a handful of years, the presence of Chinese companies has been multiplied throughout the Americas, the whole Americas, assuming different activities such as the operation or constructions of container port terminals, As an example of this, it should be considered that only HPH from Hong Kong and Evergreen from Taiwan were within the Americas area 10 years ago. But currently, as you can see, the whole Americas, initially from Mexico and Bahamas, but currently the whole Americas is filled with the presence of Chinese companies. I think this is a good introduction to the presence of non-hemispheric companies in the field of port and transportation business.
Thank you very much. We're certainly going to come back to drawing out some of the implications of this dramatic consolidation in shipping and logistics companies in our next round. But to at least hit all of our panelists, let me now turn to Andrei. And we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the defense sector explicitly, and especially military-to-military relationships and defense sales relationships. And so, as you're aware, both the Russians through Rospronexport and Rostec, as well as the Chinese, have been increasingly active players in the Latin American defense market, as well as the mill-to-mill with institutional relationships. So, Andrei, if I could ask you to give an overview of how are the defense relationships that the Russians and Chinese maintain in Latin America evolving? And could you talk about how the Russian and Chinese military engagement not only include arms sales, but other things? How do those activities that they're doing in the region impact their strategic position as part of their overall engagement in the Americas?
Thank you for the question. And first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. You personally, the U.S. Army War College, and FIU, I think this is a great opportunity for us to gather and discuss these subjects that are increasingly important. When it comes to Russia and China and the Latin American defense market and the overall strategic scenario, I usually want to start off with the post-9/11 scenario, and I'm going to go broadly political at first and then narrow it down to defense. But with the U.S. disengagement in Latin America post-9/11, what we see is that it combines itself with the increase in left-leaning governments with anti-U.S. rhetoric in Latin America, and that itself is combined with a boom in commodities. So this pretty much gives the conditions that allowed for these governments in the region to push for spaces, forums, and international regional mechanisms of political consultation. Political consultation that specifically excluded the United States from participation, and here I'm clearly talking about cases such as UNASUR or CELAC. But specifically in the case of UNASUR, what we see is that this political consultation mechanism ends up reinforcing discourse that is critical of the United States, and most importantly, that it interprets the United States as an extra-regional threat to the region. And in that context, and of course with a clear leadership on behalf of Venezuela and Hugo Chavez at the time, but also some other countries, especially the ALBA countries following behind, this interpretation of the U.S. as a threat begins to translate into changes in how they purchase or strengthen their military capabilities. And this was also pushed by another element, and in the case of Venezuela, very specific, and I'm going to end up talking a lot about Venezuela because in the end, Venezuela became a sort of a beachhead for Russian and Chinese military companies in the region. But in the case of Venezuela, there was another factor that played in there, which was the U.S. veto on arms exports to Venezuela. So up until 2005, most programs in the Venezuelan military continued along the same lines from the 90s. So Venezuela was still considering buying Western-made assault rifle to replace the FALs. It was still in the process of modernizing its F-16s. It was considering Western options to replace Mirage aircraft. It was considering Western options to increase their fleet and submarine fleet. With the veto in place, they start looking at different options. And there, Russia was very quick. And it was 2005, it was the veto. Already in that same year, we see Russians doing a visit to Venezuela with 2 MiG-29 aircraft and having a big offer to Venezuela in order to be able to substitute American-made F-16s. Venezuelan military was not impressed with the offer, but eventually, in 2006, they signed a contract for Sukhois. And this leads to a long line of purchases by Venezuela to Russia. A lot of them sustained on important credits that were given by the Russians, but others were actually paid in full by the Venezuelan government. It was a moment where the resources were available. I think that's one of the lines that we can identify during this period in Latin America, these countries that become critical of the United States' presence in the region and start interpreting U.S. as a threat. But then there's also another line. It's a lot of countries that do have strong relations with the United States, but still find in the Russian and Chinese markets options for military supplies and equipment that best adequates to their own needs. And I think that the biggest and most interesting example here is Mi-17 helicopters. Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, of course, and Argentina have all purchased these helicopters. They find them to be relatively accessible in terms of price. Maintenance is not high. So I would probably identify these two main lines between the countries in the region that are purchasing or becoming clients of Russian and Chinese hardware. What is interesting to see is that while Russia used Venezuela as a beachhead to enter the region, China did too. And it actually did it. Russia paved the way for Chinese insertion into regional arms market, and eventually started competing strongly for a lot of these contracts. Venezuela is a good example of that, with Marines in Venezuela discarding the option of Russian technology, going fully for Chinese options. But also we see that at the same time that Venezuela opts to buy trainer aircraft from China, so does Bolivia, buys the same aircraft, or later on we see Ecuador negotiating transport aircraft from China. And I think that that's where we start to see that even with a decrease or a reduction of these left-leaning governments in the region, there's still a lot of spaces for Chinese and Russian products to find themselves in the region.
And Andrei, if I could push you a little bit harder, I know you've done some fascinating work on, for example, the comparison between the way the Venezuelan army received the BTRs and BMPs and their satisfaction with the the reman T-72s versus the way they looked at when the Venezuelan naval infantry started getting the Chinese vehicles, and the way in which in some ways there was a competition between the Chinese vehicles and the Russians. Could you talk about that just a little bit?
Well, in the case of the Russian army, the Venezuelan army with the Russian equipment, I think what was very interesting is that the Venezuelans had a lot of negative feedback regarding how logistics were handled with the Russians, the contracts and the maintenance contracts mostly. So they felt that they had very little space for pursuing greater degree of maintenance in the country, or, for example, T-72s, the Russians would not allow them to use any lubricants that were not the ones purchased in Russia through Rosoboronó export. Or Venezuelans were not allowed to paint the tanks without the presence of Russian personnel there. And the Chinese, they offered just a much broader, more complete logistic package and a lot more autonomy. And this was a very important point for the Venezuelan Marines, which had been seeing for the last few years all this negative experience that the Venezuelan army was having. And then the Chinese offered a lot more autonomy, a lot more options regarding maintenance and logistics. And I think this gave them a really strong edge regarding the possibility of obtaining contracts. And we see that in the Air Force too. The Venezuelan Air Force has been pushing aside Russian options for trainer aircraft. And they went for the K-8s. They're looking at the L-15s. The problem there is money. Right now, there's no money, and the Chinese are not willing to offer new credit for those aircraft, at least not right now. But Venezuelan Air Force was very impressed that in the situations in which they found there to be some specific technical issues with the aircraft, the feedback from the Chinese would be almost immediately, and they'd look for a solution almost immediately. While when they had troubles with the Sukhoi aircraft in 2016 to 2007, it took about 3 months to get a response from Russia and get those aircraft back into operation.
Thanks, Andrei. We're going to shift gears slightly, but still on the topic of the Russians. As you know, another dimension that has received just a little bit of attention in the United States is the Russian use of both traditional media like RT and Sputnik, as well as social media vehicles, not only potentially in the U.S., but is believed perhaps in Latin America. So, Brian, you've done a lot of work on this. So could you tell us from your perspective and from your work, how do you see the Russians are impacting through these type of activities, which, as you know, go back to traditional Soviet-era type of influence and negative control, and control operations. How do you see the Russians impacting the strategic landscape of Latin America through such activities, or are they? Especially in this very important year of elections in Latin America. And as part of that, can you talk a little bit about just how it is that they use these vehicles like RT and Sputnik to achieve these ends?
Thanks, Evan. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel. Much of what I know on the subject actually comes from these gentlemen here, so thank you. Thanks to FIU for letting me be a part of this too. That's a joke, I was part of that whole planning, but I kind of wedged myself on Evan and said, Evan, would you let me be a part of this panel? I'd like to talk about some things I think are really important, and so I appreciate you letting me be here. I think it's important to zoom out a little bit first and just sort of talk a little bit about Russian interests in the region, because I think that's still, in high debate. And I think it's important to note that I think that Russian interests primarily are geostrategic. I think that Russia sees a phenomenal opportunity to engage in a region that is incredibly close and perhaps too close for comfort to the United States. In fact, I think the Russian minister this morning, or at least released, just sort of indicated that there was no such thing as a backyard in terms of the way the Russians view things. In other words, sending a message, I think, to the world that any geographic space is fair game in terms of vying for influence. So although I think there certainly is an economic interest, a political incentive, I see this geostrategic proximity to the United States as being Russia's most important objective. That said, I think that Russia has very few instruments of national power that it can wield today in a very effective manner. Russia doesn't have the kind of traditional sources of national power like military might, economic might, political might. And so I see Russia moving more towards the use of, I think, what some are terming hybrid warfare or malign influence, these sort of really hard forms of power. Two that I've written on most recently are sort of the concept of information, what Russians term as information confrontation. And the other is the use of diaspora around the world. And I kind of want to talk about both of those very briefly, and then we can certainly drill down on them. In the case of information operations, I think the primary objective is less about sort of building a Russian narrative that promotes Russian policy. I think Russia's really struggling in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union to really build a brand that it can promote in the international stage. Instead, what I think Russia is doing is really attempting to discredit Western sources of information. Right? So if you watch RT or Sputnik, some of Russia's main media outlets, it's constantly attacking Western narratives and Western values. It's less about promoting a Russian value. And we've actually seen that change, I think, over the last several years, where initially in the region, when Sputnik, RT were really forming, a lot of the messaging was a little sporadic. It was really hard to identify patterns in messaging. Over the last several years, I think you've seen a rallying around, again, this attempt to attack U.S. influence, Western influence. And in fact, the National Endowment for Democracy put out an exceptional piece called Sharp Power back in December, which talks about sort of the origins of this kind of sort of undermining. In other words, it's not about strengthening our influence as much as it's about reducing the influence of our adversaries. And I think Russia's working in this information space to do that. So in the information context, you certainly have RT, Sputnik, you have TASS. They're leveraging all platforms of media. They have several hundred several hundred channels that are being broadcast throughout the region. But they're also moving more rapidly to online and social media, which I think is where they're seeing a tremendous opportunity to really message the region. And while Sputnik and RT are really important, I think Russia's primary objective is to move RT and Sputnik into proxy media. So these are organic media outlets around the world, the El Tiempos, Comerciales, right? These smaller media outlets that don't have the resources to fact check everything or put fresh content out constantly, I think you're seeing Russia in that space try to move more content to those outlets so they can continue to produce it. And so on the information space, I think that's what we're seeing. We're really struggling, though, I think, to identify the effectiveness of that, right? So I think, yeah, go ahead.
So just to highlight your point, just to make sure I understand what you're saying correctly, because this is a very interesting point. You're saying that the focus isn't so much if RT and Sputnik are being picked up as primary broadcast channels in
Right.
the region, but rather the degree to which they can offer their free or otherwise
Right.
discounted feeds to get picked up by traditional Latin American media or even to be repeated by others. You're saying that that's really kind of the key angle of that influence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're seeing that certainly more aggressively over the last few years where, colleagues in the region will tell me how Sputnik and RT are really pushing that media onto those outlets, forming agreements to get those outlets to repost their messages. And so I think that's where they're really going. And I think the reason for that is because it increases the credibility of the message. If it comes from RT, it comes from Sputnik, it comes from Russia. But if it comes from local organic media outlets, it's a little more credible, perhaps in a Latin American context.
And this is similar to what we see through CCTV, CGTN on the Chinese side, or is this a similar type of strategy?
Well, I think Russia is certainly more involved in the information space in terms of information confrontation and using media outlets. You're starting to see China pick up on that now. The launching of Voice of China recently, right, going to be the biggest, largest financed propaganda machine out there. But I don't think they've made it there yet. I think they're still learning from the Russia model for now. But you see them certainly interested, the Chinese certainly interested in the information space. So I think that's really important on the information confrontation side. The other side, which is a little bit more novel and maybe nuanced, is the idea of leveraging Russian diaspora all around the world, and to include in Latin America. And what's really fascinating is it's out there, and the Russians aren't quiet about it, but they've stood up what's called the Coordinating Council of Russian Compatriots around the world, in which now they have about 98 coordinating councils in countries all over the world, to include 18 in this hemisphere. And the purpose of the coordinating councils is to organize, consolidate, and then guide diaspora on sort of messaging and how to engage within the country context. And when you think about diaspora in the region, you're talking about maybe north of 400,000 Russians around the region. Largest countries are in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and then sort of moderate numbers throughout the rest of the world. But what you are seeing is, and by the way, it's in very nascent stages. We're talking about a decade into the process of consolidating Russian-speaking communities. But what you are seeing is an effort, sort of an organized, what seems to be thought-out strategy to bring them all together. And then you fuse in, NGOs or foundations like the Ruski Mir Foundation, Russian World Foundation, which finances and supports a lot of the activities that are coming out of these diaspora communities. Now, of course, that's to build organic influence, I think, to some degree. Maybe one example is of an attempt to exert that influence. It's in our region, right? I mean, there's several examples of that taking place in what Russia claims it's near abroad, right? So the former Soviet states. But in Latin America, back when Mauricio Macri first took office, he attempted, or at least said that he was going to cancel the RT contracts. The Russian diaspora actually mobilized and started a writing campaign to try to compel Macri not to cancel RT. RT wasn't canceled, not sure if that was the reason why, but nonetheless, you do see some attempt to organize and leverage them as a source of influence. Now, today it's still in its very nascent stages, but the fact that this is a global effort, I think, is really important to note.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, so we're going to jump back to China now. And Enrique, I know you've worked closely with analysis of Chinese companies in Mexico, especially where CGMX does its primary work. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the difficulties? Obviously, Mexico is one of the places where there has been important Chinese investment, but there have been difficulties. We can remember the abandoned high-speed train project from Mexico City to Querétaro. We can remember some of the projects, for example, that FAW, the automaker, ran into trying to set up a facility in Mexico. Can you talk a little bit about what you perceive has been the problem, both for the Mexican government in attracting Chinese investment, but also in Chinese working in Mexico? And And what do you think that means for, if we have an Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration who would be interested in, throwing open the doors to Chinese investment? Are there certain limitations in Mexico in terms of their ability to expand business with and exports to China?
Right. So again, I would very strongly invite to differentiate between trades, credits, investment, and infrastructure. No, these are completely different fields. And for the Mexican case, at least from the work we have been doing in the last 20 years, it's very important to understand under this heading of the omnipresence of the public sector in China, which is not the same than state-owned enterprises. In the United States and other parts of the world, many people blame the state-owned enterprises, and I think this is far too short-sighted to understand this public sector in China. And the issue of the public sector, again, which in China controls and has a property of more than 50% of GDP in China, the property, in addition, you have other incentives to control other parts of the economy. This topic is very important regarding your question. This is foreign direct investment. Just to give you an idea of the dynamism of this new actor in a concrete case such as in Mexico. From 2016 to 2017, in 1 year, China's foreign direct investment in Mexico jumped by more than 20 times. No? 20 times. Of course, in 2016, you are speaking of only 80, 90 million US dollars, and this jumped again 20 times. So what are some of the problems? Some of the problems is, again, that in Latin America and in Mexico, around 80% of foreign direct investment from China are of the public sector. No? Not of state-owned enterprises, which might be 117 firms. No? So the public sector is very important, and is, if you put it politely, learning. No? Learning, in many cases, the harsh way. No? So they need a long time. This learning process is very cost inefficient. No, we have been working on detailed analysis from Huawei, no, and who in Mexico is the main supplier for all public and private firms in Mexico regarding cellular firms. So it is very, the learning process of Chinese firms investing in Mexico has been very difficult and very extensive. And by the way, the Mexican public sector also, while in the discourse, they say that they are interested in attracting foreign direct investment. To be honest, we do not understand the difference between US investment, German investment, Japanese investment, and Chinese investment. The way we have been working is that this is radically different. And if you want to attract investment, and if you want to have successful Chinese investment in Mexico and in Latin America, you have to dedicate it a lot of time. And this has so far not happened. No?
And you make a very important point, and you mentioned that there are certain companies in Latin America and Mexico, like Huawei, who have been very sophisticated in acting as a local company and sponsoring local soccer teams, and others, maybe like China Railway Road, maybe a little bit less sophisticated. Do you see important differences in the level of sophistication of Chinese companies in Mexico?
Yes, but not very much. No, again, Huawei is different than China Railway Corporation or any or other firms. But in general, again, the capability of these huge transnational public corporations in understanding, in institutionally understanding a particular Latin American country today is still very low. We've been working with the ILO, the International Labor Office, for example, how until 2017, China has created more than 2 million jobs in Latin America. Very impressive. Not even Chinese have accounted or registered these numbers. 2 million jobs, no? But again, you have I don't know, Sino-Hydro doing infrastructure projects in 15 countries in Latin America, but to be honest, they do not have a department of understanding the differences between Honduras, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Mexico, no? And so they don't have intra-firm norms and rules, etc., no? One last question regarding López Obrador. Again, I think in many parts of the world, including the United States, you have a very unsophisticated understanding of López Obrador, no? I remind you, López Obrador has been the mayor of Mexico City for 6 years. He has not eaten any kids alive. He did not impose socialism. He did not invite Chavez, etc. Life in the city continued. No? So look at the facts beyond some fear campaigns. No? Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. Ricardo, if we can turn back to the logistics, also thinking about the Chinese, if I could ask you two questions. One, to build on before, you talked about this very clear trend towards concentration, both in ports and in shipping especially. Could you explain to the audience a little bit why concentration impacts, why we should care about concentration from a perspective of U.S. commerce? And the second thing, I think you've done some very important work looking at what consolidation means in specific ports. Could you talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of, first of all, the new Chinese presence in Margarita Island and Panama and the broadening of the canal, and how that impacts the choices as you come up through the whole port system, through the Caribbean going to U.S. ports, how that Chinese presence and who owns which port, how that's important?
Yes, thank you. The impact is related to the market organization, the industrial organization of the markets. Yeah, we are very concerned because we are viewing this concentration is associated with vertical integration. Yeah, then you have a very huge concentration in the seaside, yeah, maritime transportation, but the maritime transportation companies, yeah, are the owners of the terminals, the port terminals. Then all your trade is in hands of one company for transportation and for ports. Then the threat over your trade is in terms of oligopoly or monopoly for trade, but for transportation services.
Trade and transportation services.
Yeah, this is a very growing situation in South America especially. Yeah? For the Caribbean and Central America, the threat is similar, but is closely related with the future of the One Belt, One Road. Yeah? If Margarita terminal in Panama is a part of OBOR, and the main companies crossing the Panama Canal are Chinese companies, then again, you have a good part, a big part of your trade in hands of external companies, in this case, Chinese companies. Yeah? Then this is, I think, I don't know if it's a threat, but it's enough to closely follow the situation and the evolution of the concentration.
Mm-hmm. And you also see this having an impact with the certain overcapacity in the Caribbean as well, as we look at some of the play for Caribbean ports, extending out of Panama as consolidation ports.
Yeah. In the Caribbean port sector is easy to appreciate an overcapacity, yeah, and a competition between several countries for capturing traffics. Yeah? But if you add to this situation the growing presence of Chinese companies or other extra hemispheric companies, mm-hmm. then my concern is, again, against the competition. Yeah?
Thank you. And I think you also distinguish between certain companies, we talk about HPH, better known as Hutchison, and others, and you point out that although we focus a lot here in the U.S. on Hutchison as a Chinese company, but in reality, as you point out, that Hutchison's key port, Freeport, actually has problems, and it's actually some of the other Chinese players that are of the greatest concern as they tie into the Panama Canal.
The new Chinese companies, mainly say MHI, yeah? That is closely related with COSCO and China shipping lines. Yeah? Then is, again, the transportation services plus the port terminals and distribution.
Thank you, Ricardo. So we're going to jump back to Russia again. And Andrei, we already talked a little bit about Venezuela. So to take advantage of the limited time, could we talk a little bit about what Export and Rostec have been trying to do in some of the non-ALBA countries? I know, for example, in Peru, the Russians actually suffered a big loss to the hands of the Chinese with respect to the MLRS system. They wanted to replace the BM-21 with the, I believe, the BM-30 Smerch. And some of the other places like Brazil, where there had been hopes of doing things like the Mi-35 follow-on and others, but they seem to have had less success. Are the Russians losing out to the Chinese in South American countries, or how do you see the Russians positioning themselves outside of ALBA? Are they losing ground, or are they what's happening?
I think that the Russians understand that some of their products fill spaces for specific markets that are very, very adequate, and that was why I was mentioning before the case of helicopters mainly. Mi-17s, they're seen useful across the region, and they're probably going to continue receiving contracts for such systems. When they lose out on markets, I think sometimes they lose out more to themselves than to the Chinese specifically, and it has to do with these problems I was mentioning before regarding logistics and maintenance. And sometimes this even affects their credibility with products that are consolidated, such as the Mi-17. When they sold it to Venezuela, they promised a maintenance center in Venezuela. When they sold them to Peru, they promised a maintenance center in Peru. When they sold them to Argentina, they promised a maintenance center in Argentina. We still have no maintenance centers in Latin America for Mi-17s. So these elements sometimes they contribute to them losing credibility, but also then there's, in the case of Brazil, is an excellent example. Brazilian Air Force bought Mi-35s after looking at the Venezuelan experience and the possibility of buying a brand new attack helicopter for a relatively low price. And now you see that the Brazilian Army is looking for a helicopter that fulfills pretty much the same specs, but they're interested in surplus U.S. Cobra helicopters, right? They're not even looking at the Russian options. Still, the Russians do gain ground in specific areas such as portable air defense missiles. Not only have they gotten the contracts in Venezuela, that happened in Ecuador too. In Brazil, they're negotiating a second lot of air defense missiles. Air defense systems in general are seen as very interesting. Russia puts on the table a lot of good, accessible products, and without the restrictions that many of the Western countries impose. So systems such as the ones that were bought by Venezuela in the last 10 decades would have never been sold, at least the equivalents, by United States to the region before. So then a lot of these countries are saying, well, I might not be able to purchase the most advanced air defense system from the United States, Israel, or Europe, but the Russians are offering these. And that's the case of Brazil. They're going for those types of specific markets. And then also refurbishing and modernizing systems, which, although they lost out on artillery systems in Peru, they did get a contract to modernize the MiG-29s. And now they're even talking about expanding that fleet.
Two quick questions to put you on the line a little bit. Bolivia, will the Bolivians actually have the money and will to buy Russian systems this time around? And Nicaragua, is it the hub of Russian engagement militarily in Latin America, or is it just that they have lost out the other options to engage?
I think Nicaragua I'll start with Nicaragua because I think it's very important. A few years back, when Tupolev bombers visited Venezuela, their second destination was Nicaragua, and then they went back to Venezuela and back to Russia. It's interesting. It kind of sets out the map of what are the Russian interests in the region. I think Nicaragua is also important, at least in the interpretation from Russia, because they are providing them with a lot of military aid, including some conventional systems at low cost, and providing them with capabilities that they did not have before. I think that also it's interesting to see how that worked out, because that visit from the Tupolev aircraft, when they went from Venezuela to Nicaragua, was also used in order to try out Colombian air defense systems. And basically what happened is that the Tupolev bombers overflew Colombian airspace. Colombian Air Force did not have time to react or intercept the aircraft. And that gave very valuable information to the Venezuelan military regarding the reaction capacities of the Colombian Air Force. So it also plays into not just we're selling these systems, but we're also capable of providing you with important intelligence on the capabilities of your neighbors. And Bolivia, I think that with the Chinese, they always have the advantage of very good credit lines for purchasing these systems. I think in Venezuela, they're not advancing, but because the Chinese are not the ones willing to give out the credits, but it's not the same situation in Bolivia. So we might be seeing some more purchases on that side.
But one must point out, in benefit of our Colombian partners, that once they got in the air with the Super Tucanos, they actually did put some great footage on YouTube.
With the Kafirs, yes, but it was on the way back.
Okay. Brian, turning to you, and actually, I want you actually had a very important article that you're in the course of putting out right now, taking a look at the possible role of the Russians and Chinese if the Venezuelan military plays a role in the transition of back to a democratic regime, or at least back to something else. And Frank Mora had mentioned this before. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States who have at least speculated about whether the Venezuelan military could play some role. And obviously, it's a very polemic thing. I know you in your current work have made a very important point about, well, if we start down that path, where the Venezuelan military is doing something, that there are people that have good relations with the Venezuelan military, the Cubans with the DGI, the Russians, the Chinese. Can you tell us your thinking about, what from a Chinese and Russian perspective especially should we be thinking about if the Venezuelans, for good or bad, start a role in a transition?
Thanks, Evan. And I know we're getting the 10-minute cue back there, so I'll try to make it really, really quick.
Okay.
I do want to make one point on China that I think is really important to underscore Enrique and Sergio, and that is in the sort of concept of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? It's largely, noted as an infrastructure effort, but I had the opportunity to go to the China-Latin America Summit in December in Uruguay, and the Chinese made very clear that this went well beyond infrastructure. Right, that this was a full commercial sphere that included infrastructure, certainly as a primary point, but also included, e-commerce, global services, and so the rollout of that in Latin America just seemed to be far more than sort of infrastructure. And I think it's really important to kind of dig in on that and understand the global economic implications of sort of this commercial sphere. To answer your question. So, you hear a lot about whether or not, and again, I'm not placing a value judgment necessarily on the idea of the Venezuelan military taking power or not. There's a lot of people out there that have arguments on one side or the other. The work that I was doing was more sort of a cautionary, potential scenario in which, you did have the Venezuelan military seize power, whatever that might look like. And there's sort of this understanding that that we don't have the kind of mill-to-mill relationships with the Venezuelan military that the Russians, the Chinese, or the Cubans do. And I think it's important because, again, we could lose control of that process if, in fact, the Russians, who I think would probably be the primary actor there, would, sort of attempt to undermine the United States by moving into that space for us. The Russians do have tremendous interest, not just on the military side, but also on the economic side in the form of oil, right? So through Rosneft and Sechin, who is the president of Rosneft, does a lot of work in Venezuela. You haven't seen a lot of signs of Venezuela pulling back economically like you have China, right? So China's reduced exposure in its exposure in Venezuela. The Russians haven't really showed those signs. They continue to move forward in terms of some aggressive, I think, investing in Venezuela. So it's more of a cautionary. If we do go down that path, just the mere threat or the mere sort of signal that that we may be giving might be enough to compel Russia, maybe Russia, Cuba, to thinking about alternatives to regime as well. If they also perceive that the Maduro administration is not a viable option going forward, we're going to see a lot, I guess, if the elections actually happen. I hear there's some questions as to whether or not the Venezuelan election would even take place. But in the event that does start to roll, where does the Venezuelan military sit vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis their other really important actors, right? So Venezuelan military officers now have been traveling to China, traveling to Russia for training, education, not just attending military schools, but also attending civilian universities for months, years at a time. And so that relationship, I think, is something that we have to recognize because we don't know where that regime change might occur. If you're looking at the military as a potential source of transition, at what level now are we talking within the Venezuelan military? We're talking about that senior, the mid, the junior ranks. But we do know, I think, confidently that, again, we don't have the relationships up and down the ranks that our rivals do. And we just have to be cautious when we go into this. When I say we, if this sort of begins to manifest, now how that might roll out down the road.
Thank you, Brian. Now, so with due apologies to the audience, what I'd like to do, I think we're probably going to have time for 2 questions. So let me ask if 2 members of the audience, the first 2 who can run up to the microphone. And what I'm going to ask you to do is we're going to take both questions at once, and then because of the limits of time, we'll turn it over to the panel to respond to whichever question or questions they believe are most appropriate. And also at the end, I would ask our panelists if there's anything that they would like to offer as just a quick recommendation for the U.S. policymakers who are present and the U.S. analysts present of things that they should be thinking about. So I see we're going to go to this microphone and then this microphone. So, and if you could make the questions more concise than I've made my comments. Sure. So please.
So my question is about Chinese influence in academia. In the U.S., there's been a lot of attention paid to the Confucius Institutes and Chinese student scholar associations and how the Chinese government exercises influence through those avenues, as well as funding for universities and programs that study China. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Chinese influence in universities in Latin America, whether that's a growing concern, and as well as if there's any movement on the Russian side as far as that goes.
So question number 1 is Chinese and possibly also Russian influence in Latin American academia. And yes, sir.
Yes, Darius Molansky, mayor in exile from Venezuela. Talking in the morning, there was about the coup d'etat, which in my opinion, in Venezuela, there is a coup d'etat 24/7, so it's more like a restore our institutions and the constitution. But let's say that we had that scenario, we have soldiers that try to restore our institutions in Venezuela. What would be the reaction from Russia? We have seen, for example, the Ministry of Defense that has been at least twice in Moscow this year, and I was part of the protest last year, and I saw the repression, more than 130 people killed, thousands wounded, and Russia was not only supporting that, but recognizing the illegal national constituency, and part of this strategy is try to avoid what they call the color revolution. They say that what is going on in Venezuela is an interference from the United States, that is the same that happened in Ukraine. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much, and I think just about everybody in this room would agree that our sympathy, whatever our policy positions, for the democratic aspirations and struggles of the people of Venezuela. So, Enrique, would you like to respond to?
Well, just to this question regarding Chinese influence in academia, I would tell you I've been working on this topic and participating actively for 20 years. I would highlight that probably in the academic sector we have the best of the relationships compared to the public sector and to the private sector in Latin America vis-a-vis China. No? Influence, I don't know, probably in those countries in Latin America where the academia is weaker, probably the Chinese influence is stronger. In the other countries, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, we have a very vivid and very critical exchange. We survive these critical exchanges, and we have a very active relationship. No, of course, the freedom that we have in Latin America in terms of reflection regarding our respective countries and the relationship with China is qualitatively not comparable with the difficulties and constraints that our academic friends have in China. No?
Enrique, do you believe that some institutions in Latin America that receive funding from China or whose scholars travel regularly to China, does it become uncomfortable for them to say things that are too critical about China in their own work and publications?
Not yet. Probably not like in the US, like some universities where they have had difficulties and even expelled Confucius institutes. No, I think that in most of Latin America, with very few exceptions, this critical reflection on China has only started. No, so we are, in most of the cases, very receptive of ideas, and the idea that these institutions, such as a Confucius Institute, might generate tensions, and it comes as a package with some topics, and other topics they are not included or rejected. Most of the countries have not come to this stage yet. No?
Thank you, Enrique. Ricardo.
Oh, I share the opinion of Enrique. I think Chinese, in general terms, Chinese people have difficulties for understanding the culture and the functioning of institutions. Then it is more difficult to make a real influence beyond the obvious matters, like financing, like the power of companies, Chinese companies, etc. But it's in the hard field, not in the soft field. Then the influence is right now, I think, is more related with the hard zone.
Thank you, Ricardo. Andrei?
I'll jump on the Venezuela question. I think that it's very important, and I agree with my colleague here and a lot of the statements that were made earlier today. We have to be very careful of the characteristics of any type of military uprising in Venezuela. Not only because of the influence that they have, that Russia and China have had over the officials, whether it's from higher ranking officers to all the way down to the lower ranks, but also because anybody who takes power in the future in Venezuela understands very well that their economic situation is tied to Chinese and Russian interest, whether it's through the loans that they're receiving and they still have to pay forward, or it's through the presence of Russian companies in the Faja de Orinoco. A great part of the political disputes over the last couple of years between government and opposition have had their center in the creation of joint companies between Venezuela and Russian companies for the oil exploitation. And the Venezuelan opposition was right in pointing this out because it was really pawning the future of Venezuela to a certain extent. So even beyond the military aspect of Chinese and Russian cooperation in Venezuela, just the fact that they have such a great level of influence over the Venezuelan economy makes it very likely that any type of situation in which we see a coup or a military uprising, that these players are going to become incredibly important, which also highlights another element that has been discussed lately, and is how will the international community react to a change in government in Venezuela? And do we really understand that the only way to bring back stability to Venezuela is through very large amounts of international cooperation that can help rebuild the country? And that's also going to really guide the way on how future governments in Venezuela play out.
Brian, I believe the second to last word is yours.
Yes. Let me I want to touch on both of those real quick because my read is not entirely different, but maybe, I mean, there are Confucius Institutes all over the hemisphere, virtually every country in the hemisphere, and in some cases multiple. And they're also paired with something called Confucius classrooms, which are, now sort of the attempt to go beyond the universities and then down into secondary educational institutions. It's a very distinct brand in which China is promoting. It's sort of classified under the charm offensive, right? It's really promoting what it wants those institutions to teach, and it does essentially, tell these institutions what they really can't include. And we joke about the 3 Ts. You don't talk about Tibet, Taiwan, or Tiananmen, right? Those are the 3 Ts that the Chinese don't let you talk about. Within these Confucius institutes. And so while the textbook might be, while the book on sort of the Tiananmen Square or the history book might include it, it's left off of the curriculum within Confucius institutes. And that's deliberate. And again, it's deliberate because the Chinese recognize that they don't have a great deal of soft power in the international system today, but developing soft power, acquiring soft power takes a long time, right? And so they're sort of in that charm offensive now where they're trying to lay the foundation to at least create some of that, I think, going forward. It's a sort of commensurate to what they think is their rise in the international system. So I think that's important to note. The Russians have something similar called Russian centers. There's less than a dozen of them throughout the region. Those are usually developed underneath the Ruski Mir Foundation, which is a Russian government organization. So the Russian centers are similar. They teach Russian language. They promote Russian culture. And so those 2 things are out there and I think are meant to help build the brand of those countries. On the Venezuela, I think you summed it up. I would throw maybe one really provocative statement out there if I haven't already, and that is I'm not entirely sure that the Chinese and the Russians wouldn't coordinate or I won't go so far as to say collaborate, but wouldn't coordinate at some point in this hemisphere. I mean, that's something that we've been asking. At least I've been asking in terms of research. Why aren't you seeing more Chinese-Russian, engagement together in the hemisphere? And I think the only case that we saw reported in the media was the Nicaragua Canal, sort of, and how they were engaging there. But I think what you've seen, certainly over the last several weeks, if not several months, was a growing what I think both foreign ministers came out and said last week or the week before, a growing strategic partnership. And then you had, of course, the Chinese travel to Moscow for the big military conference. And so you're starting to see at least these 2 countries come together. This hemisphere could present an opportunity in which they could, at least engage or collaborate, coordinate in a region that's not in their near abroads, right, which sort of has a far higher, sort of cost. And they could engage here. I don't know what that looks like. I haven't really thought that out. But I just want to throw that statement out there that it's not entirely impossible in the Venezuelan case, which both countries are really looking to get their money back, I mean, first and foremost, right? But also the geostrategic opportunity that Venezuela could present.
Well, I think it should be readily apparent to everyone from the discourse of these 4 gentlemen during the past hour plus, just the really world-class quality of intellect that we've been able to get them to share in coming here from across the region. Brian, not that far, but still, nonetheless, world-class intellect. So please join me in giving applause and thanks to this group.